I'm Richard Chambers, the Senior Advisor of Risk and Audit at AuditBoard, and welcome back to another episode of my podcast series, Speaking of Risk and Audit. I'm joined today by another longtime colleague, someone I've grown to know and respect over the last few years, David Hill. A lot of you will know David as the former CEO of SWAP, Internal Audit Services. And of course, they're based in the UK. But David, I think, brings a strong background in public sector or government audit, depending on your preference. And I think he's going to be able to help us today to understand some of the unique challenges that public sector auditors are facing in the 2020s. David, welcome to the podcast.
Richard, thank you. I think it's my second time with you, so hopefully it'll be as enjoyable as the first time.
Yeah,
Thanks,
well,
Richard.
yes, you did. You joined me on my Agents of Change video series that I did for AuditBoard. What we've tried to do is, we've tried to change with the times, and so now we're trying to do a full-fledged podcast. And I'm starting with folks that I know and greatly admire and respect in this series, and so I wouldn't have had many of these before we had you join us. So thank you again for doing that, David. You stepped down from your role, I guess, retired from your role as the CEO of SWAP a few months back, and you've gone on now to pursue other opportunities. You want to tell our listeners a little bit about that?
Yeah, certainly, Richard. An exciting time. I mean, since I left SWAP, I've actually been incredibly busy. I've been doing assessments. I've been writing guidance. I've been continuing to mentor about 18 individuals. Although I have to say, sometimes I feel like I'm the one being mentored, which is great. But it's a two-way street. My new website is going live hopefully this week. The intention of that is to deliver lots of training. I'll be doing EQAs and advisory work as and when requested. But I guess
So the name, I'm sorry, the name of your company that you've set up to kind of provide these services under, what's it called?
Yeah, it's called Hill Audit Training Limited. So
Right.
HAT is, if you want to call it that, but and I
So
guess
you've got a new hat, both literally and figuratively.
absolutely,
All right.
absolutely.
Well, good. Well, I'm glad you have taken this bold step. A lot of people are reluctant to do it. I know I did it about 4 years ago when I left the IIA. A lot of people assumed that meant that I was going to ride off into the sunset and never be heard from again. And boy, were they in for a rude awakening, because that was never my intention, and obviously is not your intention either, right?
It's absolutely not my intention. And I think one of my main aims is to continue. My main mission is to continue to change that perception of internal audit, so that it is a function that is valued and a function that is wanted, rather than the way it is in my sector at the moment. It's mandated, and I think that presents a few problems. So yeah, that's my mission moving forward, Richard.
Yeah. David, you and I have connected in almost like kindred spirits, I think, around the whole topic of government auditing, public sector auditing. As you know, I spent the first 26 years of my career in the public sector, albeit the federal government level in the US. And then you dedicated a significant portion of your career to the public sector as well. And I think we probably both have a great respect and admiration for what I call the unsung heroes in our profession, those who toil away often without a lot of reward, at least intrinsic reward. They don't get paid a lot. They often find themselves under a lot of scrutiny, and unfortunately, all too often, at least here in America, they can find themselves the victim of some retaliation if they step on the wrong politician's toes. How do you advise government auditors to navigate what I call the theater of politics, right? Because that's what I think government auditors have to audit in, is this theater of politics. They can't look at issues often and comment on them from a pure business perspective, because the key stakeholders are, as I've been told by one of them, we may not be good at risk management, but we're good at political risk management. So how does a government auditor navigate that environment from your experience?
It's incredibly difficult. From my own experience, I've had politics thrown at me from, from the top of the organization to indeed elected members, who can be very powerful people, actually, depending on the authorities or organizations they're working for. So one of the things I kind of always advise people is to not assume that everybody knows what internal audit is all about, because I think sometimes people make that assumption. So what I always like to say to them is, look, you need to, as a CAE, as a Chief Audit Executive, you need to demonstrate a few things. And I think that there is a mindset change needed in some areas. So I talked about internal audit is mandatory in the UK public sector. And I think in some respects, that can leave some feeling a little bit complacent. And I talked to John Tabor recently about this, the complacent CAE. And I think what we need to have is the mindset that, if it gets to a mandatory service, they need to deliver that service that is valued, both wanted and needed. So there's all of that is the resell of internal audit about what it is. And actually, a good internal audit team can help you as an organization succeed. We can help you on your mission, and help you make sure the objectives you're seeking to deliver are there, and we can support you in that case. And I think that's the message. It's going back to what I said at the outset, Richard. It's changing that perception of internal audit. And I think we'll probably get into a conversation about independence and all the other things, but it's changing that perception. We need to be a tool for management, not anything else. A tool for management moving forward.
I think we both know and we both advocate for strong and effective government audit, the government audit function. To me, these are the guardians of public trust, because our systems of government are so dependent upon the trust of the citizens and the taxpayers and those who are running government. And so I've always said, that the government auditor is really part of that system of guardianship. We help to guard against corruption, fraud, waste, mismanagement. And that can be a challenging undertaking, especially under the glare of the lights, as we said.
It is incredibly challenging, and we have whistleblowing policies, we have lots of things coming towards our attention. And I think sometimes you've got to be a bit mindful in picking the right areas. It's got to be the important areas that, affect the organization's objectives and their delivery. But equally, we've got to have that big transparency agenda. And we've got to, I often talk, you'll see, Richard, I often talk about the Nolan principles, which are the Nolan standards within the UK about good governance, about good standards, about integrity. All these things are ultimately important. And as a CAE or as an auditor, you have to stand there. You have to be whiter than white, but somehow you also need to have that courage, which is now talked about in the new standards, have that courage to call it out when we need to call it out. And I do fear sometimes that the pressure can be so great that sometimes people are afraid to actually raise their head above the parapet and say, actually, this is not right. We need to do something about this. And that remains a concern for me for many years, really. Not in every quarter, but of course, coming back to what I call the complacent CAE, sometimes, if we're under a lot of pressure, it's a lot easier to sit down there and just get on with your job rather than actually, raise the ante a little bit sometimes.
As I said earlier, I came up in the federal government system in the U.S. And for much of my career, when I was in the Inspector General world, I had ample resources. I mean, resources often that we could measure in the hundreds.
Yeah.
That's not the real world for government audit in the vast majority of instances. Certainly not in the UK. You've got these council audit teams that are often very, very lean, very small. And we have the same thing in America with municipal audit departments, sometimes no more than 2 or 3 people. Maybe they have enough luxury to have 5. That's a constrained level of resources. It's really tough, particularly if the agency or the council has significant resources at its disposal. There's a lot of risk and not a lot of opportunity there in terms of the resources for audit to cover that risk. What advice do you give heads of internal audit in government agencies about how you can still make an impact with a small team?
And Richard, it's such a valuable point because it is such a challenge for particularly small internal audit teams. And they're often judged on their outputs. So they're judged on, did we deliver the same number of audits last year as we did, as we're doing this year? And, I was talking to group of CAEs last year at a conference, and I was quite taken aback that many of them didn't actually know what their financial budgets were. What they understood their budget was basically, this is my organizational structure. I have a head of internal audit or chief audit executive. I have a principal auditor, maybe a senior auditor and two auditors, and they will deliver X amount of days for me. And that was their focus. That was all their focus. So for me, one of the things that we've got to get better at, and I think again the new standards can help us in that area, is being more transparent about the financial audit budget. How are we going to spend that budget to the betterment and the best way we can deliver the most effective internal audit for the organization? And unfortunately, those discussions haven't necessarily been high profile in public sector. It's actually it's the audit days, and it's the wrong measures, it's the wrong KPIs. So I'm hoping that with the new standards, when we talk about discussing the budgets, I really hope that CAEs will go into audit committees and say, this is my financial budget. This is what a current delivers in terms of resources. But hey, I can make that money work better for us, because actually, if we actually invest in a bit of technology, look at AI, actually start looking at data analytics rather than talking about it, you're going to get much more bang for your buck by having that discussion. So I think there's a real in for CAEs with the new standards to discuss budgets, because that's the only way. Otherwise, they're going to be the same internal audit team 3 years, 5 years down the line, and they will, as you've often referred to, they'll become irrelevant. They will be of no value to the organization. And that ends only in one way, quite frankly.
One of the things that I've really respected and admired is the fact that you're out there telling government auditors and really auditors across all sectors, you got to audit smarter, better, faster, quicker, all of those things. And so you've been offering some what I would call practical advice, but then you've also been offering some pretty transformative advice. I think a lot of people's eyebrows were raised when you were out there talking about the one-page audit report. And, in some ways, I don't want to be so brash as to say that it put David Hill on the map, but in some ways it did, because suddenly, I mean, I'm in the Middle East talking about, auditing at the speed of risk, and I mentioned this one-page audit report concept that had come out of SWAP and from David Hill, and suddenly I could tell the whole class leaned forward. They wanted to know more. Your one-page audit report concept, you want to enlighten our audience, maybe those who haven't been exposed to it, about exactly what it is and how you find that it really helped?
Yeah, I mean, I have to give Rupert Bamberger, my director of continuous improvement, a lot of credit here, and the SWAP team. But I remember many years ago doing some metrics about how long it took to start an audit to the end of the final audit report, being agreed. And it was breathtaking. It really was breathtaking how long it had taken. These were risk-based audits. They shouldn't be taking 6 to 8 months to clear. That's not risk-based auditing. Today, I saw a LinkedIn post about audit budgets, and I don't know whether you saw it, Richard, but about 35% of people were saying they needed between 750 and 1,500 hours to deliver an audit. 750 hours is 100 days. No, so not only is, by the time you can see the time lag straight away with that, so, and all the bottlenecks that will be in there anyway. I won't even get onto the cost of delivery of that audit, 100 days or whatever. But what we were trying to do is really bring down that lag in terms of, field work completion. There's what we need to do as a team, as an organization, about some of the things we found. So the one-page report also cut out a lot of the unnecessary noise, the auditor's journey. Hey, this is what I've done. This is how I've justified my budget. And by the way, there's not really a lot to report at the end of it. So the one-page report was designed to get to the end of the product much quicker. And bearing in mind, we had an audit management system. So we had the full evidence of what we'd done, how we arrived at our conclusions. So horses for course is a phrase I often use. If we had to run a full audit report, which would run into 20, 30, 40 pages, we could still do that. So that was always in our back pocket. But actually, the one-page report and the audit committee a glance report, it got great plaudits. People read the reports, and actually actions were then taken. And so much so that what we actually found, Richard, is that 3 or 4 of our chief execs within our large partnership was so enamored with it that actually it made them get up and say, actually, right, every month I want to see all these agreed actions and have they been implemented? And if not, why not? And someone's going to high jump if they haven't. So, it was, I think it's a really simple solution. And of course, now moving forward, the question will be, how do we communicate results full stop? Will it be by a report? And as you know, Richard, for working with us for a period of time, we've moved to dynamic dashboards. Dynamic dashboards now are telling the story as we go along. It's not, at a point in time as we go along. So there's lots of new ways of reporting and communicating results. The secret is it's got to be quick. It's got to be quick. That's my view.
We're living we're living in an age of Twitter, of infographics. I mean, people are used to absorbing information in small bites, but they need to know what they need to know. Don't burden me with a lot of superfluous information. And yet, in a lot of ways, as auditors, we're still kind of coming to them in the horse and buggy.
Yeah.
Hey, this is my audit report. This is how we've done it for the last 25 years, and I'm not going to change it now. And you're saying, you know what? That's that's a relic. You cannot make the impact in the 21st century, certainly not in the 2020s, if you're going to bring them a long, laborious audit.
It almost, which it comes to the whole foundations of internal audit in many respects, as also, almost as a profession, we built this animal up, I think, in some respects. So
Yeah.
we have annual audit plans. Their audits are boxed into a quarter, so we know what we're expecting next quarter and the quarter thereafter. And we've got a budget against each audit, and that's our budget. So we scope to the budget rather than scope to the risk. There's so many areas of internal audit that we've created that are really unnecessary, and they are relics of the past, and we need to move past that. So we can, as you say, report in snapshot. Get there quickly to the main message of what we're trying to deliver to the organisation. So there's lots to learn, and don't get me on audit committee reports and the length of those. So there we go.
No, I think we're of the same mind on a lot of these things. The other characteristic of the era that we're living in, or another characteristic, is that the risk landscape is so dynamic that the idea that I can anticipate the risks that I'm going to face 12 months or 2 years from now is laughable. I mean, it doesn't happen anymore. I mean, you think about what just in the last 5 years, and we'll focus on it from the government auditor perspective. Government auditors in the last 5 years have had to deal with everything from the worst global pandemic in 100 years that pretty much shut down society as we knew it, and had extraordinary impacts on government entities. They've had to deal with that. They've had to deal with the economic uncertainties of, okay, are tax revenues going to be going up next year? They're going to be going down, because it all depends on what happens in the macroeconomy, and the macroeconomy is so volatile and unpredictable. But the point is, with all of this happening, how does any auditor, much less a government auditor, but how does anyone keep tabs on what are the real risks, so that I can make sure that I'm dedicating these, as we've already documented, scarce audit resources to the real risks facing my agency or my council?
Well, one of the things that I am always amazed about is the people who seem to think networking is not for them. That amazes me. And I always think networking, looking across organizations from the same sector, sometimes looking across organizations from different sector, can really give you an insight into potential risks that are coming down the road. Quite often, you'll see things happening in another sector which, you might not think will affect you. But when you look at it in a bit more detail, you're thinking, actually, this will affect us at some point. And it could be a change in legislation. It could be, anything. So I think for me, one of the things I'd always say to auditors and CAEs is obviously network. Obviously, understand your organization. That's a must. But understand the whole sector, what's going on within the sector. Keep up to date with it. It's no point in just being localized to deliver your plan. You have to think much wider than that nowadays. You have to really think where these risks coming from. Where's these black swan events going to come from? I think if you think like that, you've got at least a chance, a fighting chance to, be ahead of the game. But if you're going to have your head down in the sand and just deliver your plan at your local site, you've got no chance. And you're being unfair to the organisation you serve, quite frankly, from that point of view.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. When we talk about risk volatility, I mean, 2025 may be a little quieter than the last 2 or 3 years, but it remains to be seen. We're only days into the year, and so we don't know what next week or next month will bring. I'm sure all of our friends and colleagues in Southern California didn't anticipate the disruption that was gonna happen to their lives in the first days of this year. But if you're talking to government auditors and you're kind of trying to help open their eyes to some potential risks that they should be watching out for in 2025, does anything jump to mind?
Yeah, there's so many risks out there, Richard, at the moment, and it's the volatility is quite clearly there. And one of the things as auditors, we have to be adaptable to be in a position where we can respond to these risks. But we have in the UK, we have financial sustainability is a big issue. Many of our public sector bodies are really struggling. There's still the impact from the cost of living crisis that's still going on, which strains services because we've got handout benefits and support and all the other stuff. Adult social care in the UK, we've got an aging population that brings its own demands. There's even workforce shortages after the pandemic. So there's a whole host of stuff on the recruitment and retention going on. Children's services, again, loads of issues around child protection, safeguarding. So that, and then before we even start, we come to climate change. Obviously, we're seeing what's going in LA, the horrible scenes in LA. But you know, climate change, cybersecurity threats, digital transformation. I've not even touched on AI yet, but we there's so many things going on, and then we talk about data protection, and privacy, and one of the things with that is how do we actually get to a place where we can start sharing data in a much more in a way that actually allows an organization to not talk in silos and operate in silos. We can all have the data and let's make decisions that are good for the organization. So there's lots of risk out there at the moment, Richard. And I think some of the ones that we're probably not thinking about are, well, I think we probably are, but I don't think everyone's thinking about it. It's the AI and all the emerging technologies. The pace of AI and those technologies at the moment is something I personally never witnessed.
Yeah.
And then I suppose the other two things really are the sort of geopolitical risks at the moment. There's lots going on geopolitically, and then demographics. I think that's an issue I know it's an issue over your neck of the woods, but I think it's an issue across the world and something we've got to get to grips with. And I'm not
I
sure.
think it's sage advice as always, David. You know, historically, government auditors have been among the more traditional in the way that they audit and in the way that they deliver value. And I think a lot of government auditors still cling to the mission of providing assurance. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I mean, ultimately, value protection is so important as guardians of public trust. But what about beyond assurance? You've run a very, very large organization serving councils, public sector entities. What else besides, assurance engagements where you're able to provide some assurance on the effectiveness of controls and risk management and so forth, typically looking backward, what else can government auditors do to create value for the agencies they serve?
I think I don't know whether you said this, Richard, or I certainly heard it somewhere. Someone visionary maybe said that the audit plan in the future will be made up of much more advisory work rather than the assurance work. And I'm
I
absolutely
think I think that came out in the Vision 2035 report of the IA. I think
right.
they asked the respondents to sort of look forward, and I think there was an expectation there would be more advisory work, but I think they were still by and large thinking that they would be focused on assurance, which, I've said, and you've heard me say it, that I think that, looking forward, I could envision that AI would be the primary source of assurance, and we better find something else to do to add value, or the AI phenomenon is going to disintermediate us.
Absolutely. And I'll shout out to my colleagues at the government internal audit agency, always a mouthful to say, but they're doing some fantastic work with AI and automating processes. So where does that then leave them moving forward? What it leaves them is a team that can be much more responsive, proactive, doing advisory work, work that's a lot of value within that work, actually. And it tends to be looking forward, or at least it's in time with the event of that organization. So you've got their auditors released to be able to help with new innovations, new IT systems, or whatever it might be. So that helps them really form that position of an ally to the organization. And I think that's really important. I think assurance work absolutely has value. We can't dismiss it. But as you said, Richard, often it's backward looking. And I think maybe advisory, forward looking, getting in on the ground, getting your feet dirty, I think is probably the way that internal audit will go. And of course, it's like anything. I think auditors can really play a pivotal role in any organization's strategy if they align their work with, both foresight and make sure it's aligned to what the real risks are for that organization moving forward. No good sticking to a static plan. Absolutely no good at all. As I said, we need to be agile, adaptable, and responsive moving forward.
And speaking of looking forward, David, sort of to wrap a bow around our conversation today, if you're advising a head of audit in a public sector entity, or really any head of audit, but let's keep our focus here on government for this final question. What would your advice be in terms of navigating the uncertainties and sort of having a strategy for the next 5 years? What do you think? Let me phrase it a different way. What do you think are some of the big strategic risks that government auditors need to have on their radar?
Well, I think, to bring this to life, Richard, just last week, a large council not far from where I am actually announced that expecting to lose around 800 jobs because of its investment in new technologies and the use of AI. My advice to CAEs really is to, I've talked about it, embrace continuous learning, keep on top of innovation, invest in technology. Absolutely. You've going to have to learn to foster a culture of agility and adaptability. And I think it was Ursula Smith said the other day that, everyone's a stakeholder. And I think, you have to build strong relationships with stakeholders. And I think it's only by doing that, building these strong relationships, and I've talked about innovation, investing, etc., that you can kind of navigate to a future where you as a CAE or as an auditor can support that organization going forward. I've talked about the risks previously, Richard. There's loads of risks out there, but the only way to really be effective as an internal audit team or a CAE is to make sure you're on top of them and you can provide some insight to your organization, not looking backwards, looking forwards, something you've always talked about, Richard.
Thank you, David, for all your great insights during this episode. I knew when I moved forward with AuditBoard to this new series that we needed to get people on, we need to bring guests on who enjoyed the credibility to be as a voice of advice and wisdom, but also someone who really could speak firsthand from experience, and you can certainly do that. So thank you for joining us on this episode of Speaking of Risk and Audit. And
Richard.
speaking of risk and audit, I would invite our audience to keep an eye out for future episodes. And until then, I'm Richard Chambers.